Like I said, my name is Eric Davis. I'm the Conservation Director with Common Ground Program here, based in Kearney. But as you can see on the screen, Andrea is the Assistant Professor in Cropping Systems at the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture at UNL. And that is what I was going to say as her title, so of who she was. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea and let her speak about what she does and what she has learned and teach us a little bit about cropping systems and soil health.
Thank you, Eric, and your team for the invitation. You know, Eric had invited me, I think it was back in January. We had planned to do this in Minden together. I think it was in March or April. And so we're finally getting around to it, of course, not in person, but appreciate the opportunity to visit with all of you who have joined this evening. So I see that there's some pretty experienced soil folks in the room, so I hope you'll all learn something, but wanted to just talk about kind of broadly the role of soil in society and some of the things that are happening with soil health in Nebraska. So I often like to say that soil is really the underdog of natural resources, that we hear a lot about air quality, we hear a lot about water pollution, but I don't know that we think so much about soil sort of as a general population. And so I hope you might leave tonight thinking about the fact that the soil under our feet is more than just dirt and that it's really important in all of our lives. All right, so some of the things I want to talk about with all of you tonight, just some basics about soil, and that might be really familiar to some of you, but hopefully it's new or interesting to others of you. Talk about soil change by the numbers, some of the things that I think are really interesting and important. And then I want to talk a little bit about what soil health is and some of the things, again, that are happening in Nebraska, and then close leaving with some ideas about why this matters for all of us in our society, in particular with changing climate that we're all dealing with. So I've got some questions, some that are kind of more straightforward than others, but I wanted to start with a question, which is just, what is soil? So you can see A, B, C, D here, and I would say choose what you think is the best answer. And if you want to play along or just keep score to yourself, that's great, but you can definitely use the chat feature to put what you would say is the best answer to this question of what is soil. Don't be shy. I do this with my students on Zoom. Okay, so Stacy's the first brave one to say C. Maya, C with an exclamation point. I love it. Okay, we got a couple C's. Great. I think if this was a best answer, choose the best answer, I would say C, soil. I would describe soil as the living skin of the earth. In fact, that's usually the definition that I use. And so I want to tell you why soil is, why I think about soil as the living skin of the earth and how, you know, it is alive and critical to our health. Okay, so how much of the earth's surface, next question, contains soil that can be utilized for crop production? Is it A, B, C, or D? Okay, we've got some different answers here. We got some A, some B, some C. Anybody else want to take a guess? All right, we got 1D. So we have one of every answer. Great. So the answer is actually about C, right? And so the American Farmland Trust, which is an organization that works to try to protect farmland, they have this great animation if you Google the Earth as an apple. And what they show is, if you think about the Earth as an apple, right? 75% of the Earth's surface is water, right? So we know that would only leave about 25% potential to answer this question. So of that remaining 25%, they do this great animation where they zoom around the Earth as an apple, right? Of the remaining 25%, about half is not, of the land surface is just not hospitable for farming. It's things like mountains, deserts, it's covered in snow or ice. So maybe it would have some other agricultural uses like grazing, but not really for growing crops. So that leaves us with an eighth of that apple. And then of that eighth, like 3/4 of that or so is paved by cities or really poor quality. So that really only leaves us about 32 or about 3% remaining. So if you think about, 1/32 of an apple, and then you think about that skin, which is really just the outer part, the soil, that really doesn't leave a whole lot of the Earth's surface for what we're trying to do when we talk about conserving soil on a global scale, right? It's just really a small percent that we're talking about that we're trying to maintain for the future. So I love some of these soil quotes that I wanted to share, right? So this first one I think is just really a fun one, and this is the best that I can find the internet attributing it to, that we require to live a 6-inch layer of topsoil and rain. Hugh Hammond Bennett, the second quote, was the first director of the Soil Conservation Service, which is now the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which I'm sure many of you know grew out of the Dust Bowl and works as a part of USDA to conserve natural resources such as soil. And then this other one from FDR, right? So I actually have a pin that shows this too. I got this at a sale from our soil judging team. Nation that destroys the soil destroys itself. All right, so I know there's a couple ringers on this webinar, but maybe they won't be the first ones to chime in, but I like to start in thinking about kind of the soil's importance and, how precious the resource is by thinking about how it forms. So if you've not had a soils class before, this might be a new concept to you, but so which of these factors contribute to the way that we actually form soil? Is it climate, the geology of a region, vegetation or other organisms in an area, or is it all of these? Let me pull up the chat. Oh man, maybe we've got some soil gurus already on this call. Lots of answers D. Good, I like that choice of D. And the reason that I like to start with this again, because I think it kind of puts the preciousness of the resource into the longer term perspective that it deserves, right? So the reason that I describe soil as a living skin of the earth in this way, that it really is the interface of all of these factors, right? The biology, the geology, climate, and also time. It takes a lot of time to form soil. So when we're talking about soil, we're really talking about the upper layer of the Earth's crust that we interact with for agriculture, right? So all of these things contribute to soil formation, right? So the parent material, the geology of an area, so if I just think about it kind of in a more basic sense of just the rocks that break down over time, the topography of an area is obviously going to have an impact on the type of soil that you would find in an area, or different characteristics from one landscape position to another. Time is obviously a really critical factor, because this does not happen, even in a year. This happens over very long time periods. It happens, year by year, but not quickly. Climate is also really critical, as well as I'll just talk a little bit more in a minute, but as well as organisms and vegetation. So the other reason that I like to talk about this is because it reminds us that in a place like Nebraska, we are really blessed to have a disproportionate amount of some of the most naturally productive soils in the world, right? So one of these soil forming factors is climate, right? So we think about the breakdown of geologic material like rocks, for example. That is going to happen at different rates depending on if you have an area that is more humid, less humid, higher rainfall, lower rainfall, right? So areas in the tropics can be more stripped of their natural fertility because they've been exposed to just more of those weathering processes, more physical and chemical decomposition of the soil. When we talk about vegetation or organisms, so I'm showing a map here of just the native vegetation across the United States. This obviously, I like to show this back to back because the climate in the more humid regions of the eastern United States, we are, straddling several different regions, climate regions, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with in Nebraska, but that tends to overlay with what type of vegetation that we have. So the more humid regions that in the east have more typical native vegetation of trees. In the Midwest, we know in the plains, more tall grass or short grass prairie, more arid regions, more kind of shrub vegetation. And then as you get more to the West Coast, you would see more temperate or forest conditions, just as a matter of having more rainfall in those areas, right? So vegetation, the organisms that are above or within the soil have a great impact, right? So just making the point here where we are in Nebraska, that as a result of this native tall grass prairie that we've had thousands of years of turnover, rapid turnover of roots of those grasses, and those are going to turn over much more quickly than you might see in trees. And so that actually contributes to more fertile soils where we are in the Midwest, right? And so the next thing I want to show, just kind of in the scheme of the soil forming factors, this is what the dominant soil orders of the US look like. If you kind of overlay all of those maps where you see, generally speaking, kind of more temperate climate and more grassland vegetation, that's where you see this green here. This green is mollisols. So if you're not familiar with that term, these tend to be the most naturally productive soils in the world. And so the US in general has a disproportionate amount of mollisols relative to its land area. So there's like 4 other major areas of the world in Brazil, Argentina, China, and parts of Western Europe that also have a large amount of mollisols as well. But we have a disproportionate amount in the United States, and we also have a disproportionate amount, as you can see. We're very lucky to see all that green in Nebraska. And so I want to kind of keep coming back to this point that we are very lucky from just where we are to have a disproportionate amount of naturally productive, fertile soil. And so related to this, so if we're thinking more this evening kind of on a geologic time scale, I want to talk about some real numbers that I'm familiar with about soil erosion and soil degradation. But I want to start the conversation with another question, which is, how long does it take to form soil? Okay, so is it about an inch per year? If we think about that decomposition process and the kind of weathering of rocks, is this happening at about an inch a year, half an inch a year, quarter of an inch per year, or less than a millimeter per year? Nathan says it depends. It always depends, doesn't it? But okay, so we've got a bunch of answers for D, maybe C. So it certainly does depend, but I like to come back to this. This is like, you know, as an academic, we kind of fall in love with certain papers. This is one by David Montgomery, who's written a couple of really interesting books about the importance of soil in society. He's actually more of a geologist than a soil scientist, but he put together a study where he looked at all of the different published erosion rates around the world. Okay, so you can see here in this table the sample size, so the number of studies that he found, the median rate, the mean rate, and what the variance was around those values, right? So the way I'm getting that less than a millimeter formation per year is that basically he just looked across what have people measured and found for the formation of soil and the rate that occurs, right? So I'm looking right here, and so I'm looking at this mean rate, which is less than 1 millimeter or 0.03 millimeters. If we think about the thickness of a penny, we're talking about maybe 1.5 centimeters. So much, much smaller than the thickness of a penny in 1 year is how quickly soil is forming, okay? And so I want to compare that number to some erosion numbers that we know, right? So we know that when we get wind events, we had a pretty wild wind event that rolled through a few days ago here, or when we have heavy rain events, we know that we can lose soil. So how quickly does that happen relative to how quickly it forms, right? So what I'm showing you here is a map that I put together using data from, it's called the Daily Erosion Project. So you could Google this if you are really excited about soil and soil erosion. So this is work that's done out of Iowa State University, which is where I went to graduate school. I was not a part of this, but it's really cool and interesting work. So what they do every day is with a model based on topography and land cover and rainfall, they make a prediction for all these different watersheds that you see here across the Midwest, which includes, and the plains, which includes some watersheds in southeast Nebraska. So they make a prediction on how much soil loss there is every day. And so what I do with my undergraduate students in my spring class, this is one of the first activities we do, and this is the activity that I put together for them this past spring, is I just download what was the data last year. So this is the total hill slope soil loss for the year in these different watersheds. And so I have them convert the value from kilograms per meter squared. Using the density of soil, we convert this to, and I'm not obviously making you guys do this now, I'm going to give you the punchline here. I have them convert this so we can compare apples to apples in terms of units from that paper about what is the known formation rate of soil. And so what we can see is that just in 2019, which we know in Nebraska, we got a lot of rain, that the soil loss rates in these three watersheds were either 32 times, 78 times, or 148 times greater than the annual formation rate. So just to underscore that point, that basically means that in 1 year, we could have as much erosion as it took for soil to, 32 to 148 years to form, we could lose in 1 year. So it takes a long time to form, and just like that, it can move to somewhere else that is a pollutant or somewhere where we don't want the soil, right? So yeah, this is just underscoring that point too. I just want to also share that within that Montgomery paper, they make the point that no-till agriculture and all those studies that they put together, so that was almost 15 years ago now that that was published, that those erosion rates for no-till soil were much lower and much closer to known soil formation rates relative to conventional agriculture for the studies that they found. So that there's some ways that we might farm that are less degradative than others, right? And then I also want to mention some other work actually was done at Iowa State, and I'm working now with a graduate student who's doing some similar work in Nebraska, which is really exciting. I don't have anything to share about that, but there's a lot of places in Iowa that look a lot like parts of eastern Nebraska too. So this was work that was done, published a few years ago in Iowa, where what they did was really clever. So they went around, and the USDA has taken kind of historic measurements of various soil properties. And we have them in Nebraska too, and that's what this new graduate student, he's not that new, but a graduate student is looking at. And so what they did was they went back to, you can see here, these old samples from the mid-20th century and resampled in the same places to look at how various, you can see all these various properties that they looked at, and I'm not going to get into all the details of them, but they basically wanted to say, yeah, how has the relative intensification of agriculture over the period of about 1960 to the early 21st century, how have things changed? And so what they and I also have my students do a little calculation of this using numbers from this paper, and so I want to just underscore some of the main findings that they have. So we talking about erosion, that we can lose soil very quickly. What would take decades to form, we could lose in a year. What did they find was most important when they looked at this about 60-year period, and what might have been the reason for it, right? So they found that there were some of the largest changes in the structure of the soil, and they attribute this to a shift in our cropping systems from a time when we used to have more crops or grasses with more continuous roots in the soil that would continually enhance the structure of the soil. They also found evidence of acidification, so lower pH of the soil and lower concentrations of organic matter lower in the root zone, which might be more kind of specific to Iowa. They attribute that to having more artificial tile drainage that's moving the water table down. But that acidification likely a result of more chemically based nitrogen fertilizers, which are on most farms pretty, well, of course, management will vary from person to person, but I do think that pH is something that a lot of farmers do monitor, but in spite of that, they found evidence over the 60-year period of acidification in the soil. And so I'm going to transition now. My little transitions here. I've got pictures of my dog to show these transitions. This is my dog, Quincy. He's a 3-year-old Airedale Terrier, and he's not in the room with me right now, so he's probably grumpy about that. But what's the main point I want us to take home from this last section, right? That soil is alive. It takes a long time to form, generations or hundreds of years, but that it can be eroded or degraded within a day, a few decades of kind of some of the intensification practices of agriculture, right? And I also think it's important to mention that we are home to a disproportionate percentage of some of the world's most productive and high quality soils in Nebraska. And kind of building on that, I want to shift and talk about what soil health is, what was, advertised in the bill today. And this is really a concept that I think, if you are not within, directly embedded in the agriculture community, I think that this is a concept that really resonates with folks. So the idea is that the soil will have continued capacity to function as a living ecosystem that sustains life, right? That sustains plants, animals, humans, and this important temporal component that it can be managed for the future. But really when we're thinking about like, how do we measure, how do we quantify soil health, we're talking about some of the biological, chemical, and physical characteristics of the soil. And soil health is big right now. This is kind of all the rage, right? It's pretty exciting. I just want to make the point that obviously you're here on taking time in your evening to learn a little bit more about soil health. Conservation Nebraska is dedicating some time to it, but all these major news sources, I mean, it's so fun to see on the Washington Post, like if anyone has seen this Soil Your Undies demonstration, people will bury cotton underwear in different fields and see how quickly the microbial activity breaks down the underwear, right? But it's a really cool demonstration. I haven't done it myself, but there's a Washington Post talking about the links between our health and soil health, right? And I'm going to mention it in just a little bit here, but we, a former colleague and I wrote a paper about infiltration rates and different farming practices. And the Omaha World Herald ran a nice story about it. It was pretty exciting. It was me at home, excited to see the Omaha World Herald on a Sunday writing a story about our infiltration, right? Water getting into the soil. Who knew that that would be so exciting? So people are really excited about soil right now. And the other piece of this is that if you're following the, presidential cycle over the last year, that I about fell out of my chair during one of the debates when I heard cover crops and soil mentioned. We also have a growing number of state policies that are promoting soil health, which I'm going to mention here in just a minute. And you see the growing interest in ecosystem service markets, right? So there was a big USDA grant just awarded in central Nebraska with the Nature Conservancy and some other partners with Central Platte NRD and Upper Big Blue NRD to start piloting some of these ecosystem service markets. So trying to reward farmers for improving their soil, getting greater environmental benefits. So I do think that in a positive note, this whole idea around how do we improve the physical, chemical, and biological aspects of soil, right? So I'm just showing you a few of the soil properties here. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but just so you can see that we're talking about not just one aspect. I do think like the chemical aspects of soil have been a huge emphasis for agronomists in my field for decades, right? But we're really moving more into a realm where people are paying attention to and measuring and monitoring their biological health. So some of these properties that you see here as well as the physical aspects. That's something I've done more work on, again, talking about infiltration or the structure, compaction, water relationships of the soil. So when we're talking about soil health, we're talking about kind of all of these things together. So not just one aspect, but all of them, a more holistic measurement of soil. So I want to just briefly mention and then come back to Nebraska. What are the principles of soil health? So what are the kind of ways that we might manage soil on a farm, even in a garden, that are known to promote some of those physical, biological, and chemical aspects of the soil, right? So we know that if we disturb the soil less, if we do things like minimum tillage or less tillage, that is a widely agreed upon principle that has the potential to improve the function of the soil. If we keep the soil covered for longer periods of time with roots or with residue, that is also known to promote those improved properties that I've just shown you, improved function of the soil. Using a diversity of plants above ground is another principle of soil health. Living roots, so it's related to soil cover. And then integrating livestock, so having that coupling of animals as well. So there's, the biodiversity component as well as the minimizing disturbance and maintaining cover component. So if we think about, from a cropland perspective, which is, my title is in cropping systems, and it's what I have the most experience in studying. So if we think about all the crops that we see around in Nebraska, right, we could envision how we might, what are some of the management practices that we might use to enact these principles, right? So I want to poll again, here's question 5. So what do we think? What percent of Nebraska croplands are growing cover crops? So cover crops would be a plant we would grow to cover the soil when it would otherwise be bare, which typically in our cropping systems, we would think about this being something that we grow over winter before corn, soybean, or with wheat. Okay, so we've got a couple answers on the board, couple D's, 1 C. All right, so a lot of folks already intuitively knew the answer here, or like me, drive around in the wintertime and see lots of bare soil and get really sad. But I just wanted to show, some of the numbers of how we're doing in Nebraska, right? So Nebraska does, by percentage wise, according to the last Census of Agriculture from the USDA, lead the Corn Belt in no-till acres. So we have about half of our acres that report that they are using no-till practices. And I'm showing you the numbers from the USDA Ag Census between 2012 and 2017 that they increased 109% in acreage and cover crops, but that still is only representing about 4% of cropland acres. So, and then I have this other number here that actually this is less than 10% of cost share dollars. So the USDA NRCS does provide some financial benefit to farmers who sign up for their programs to grow cover crops. And they're actually only incentivizing about less than 10%, which is great that there are that many other people who have found the value of using cover crops on their farms, right? So still only about 4%, but I like to make the point here that I wish we had better data for this. I wish we had a count every year. I think that being able to track some of these trends is really important for all the things that I'm talking about today. So we get numbers from the Census of Agriculture. There's some movement to have more of this data tracked by satellite, but we really don't have great continuous numbers for some of these things. So the only ones that I'm mentioning here when I talk about those principles, I'm really just showing you some numbers for no-till and cover crops, because a lot of these other things we just don't really have good data for, unfortunately. And then the last point, just in terms of soil health, that I wanted to mention is about the Nebraska legislature. And I see if Ray Ward is on this call, he is a member of the Healthy Soils Task Force. And so we actually passed legislation, him and other farming leaders from around the state were nominated by the governor due to this bill that was passed in 2019 by the state legislature, LB 243, So the idea was to create a healthy soils task force who were leaders around Nebraska to put together a plan that would try to support the growth of and more use of soil health related practices in the state. So I think that's really positive, because while there are a number of states who have passed healthy soils types of bills, we are one of them, right? So I think it's, you know, I've been a part of some of these conversations. I'm not a part of the task force, but I think that it is, you know, from my perspective, generating a lot more interest and attention. And they will have a public report out later this year for the governor. So, you know, a small piece of legislation in this, you know, activity could really go a long way. So there's certainly more room for this to grow on the horizon in Nebraska. Okay, I see something in the chat that I'm going to just check. Oh yeah, thank you. Growing a Revolution. Richard is sharing that as one of David Montgomery's books. Yes. Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations is another good one too. So, okay, I want to finally transition. This is another photo of our dog we took by the Capitol. But transition us with to the final segment that I wanted to talk about today, which is just the role of soils in society and how healthier soil can be good for us as a state and as a wider community. So I'm going to lead with a question. All right, so what do you think was the cost of damages for flooding just in 2016 in the United States? 500 million, 3 billion, 10 billion, or 20 billion? Okay, I see several guesses of C. I see one D. The answer is D. So I just kind of picked one year. That was actually probably not the most anomalous year, right? So this is an estimate from NOAA, who tracks the number of billion-dollar disasters that we have. And so this is just an estimate that they had. There were a few different flood events that year in Texas, West Virginia, Louisiana, the Ohio Valley. Just those events alone were nearly $20 billion, right? And that was 2016. Okay, so these are damaging and costly and really traumatic events that when they happen can impact a community, right? As we experienced in Nebraska last year. Okay, so related to this, what percentage of crop insurance payouts do you think was a result of flood and drought events? Was the cause of payout just between 2011 and 2016? Let's see, this might be a little tougher for the group. I think this is my last question too. I feel like some of you are getting like 100 on it. We'll have to find out at the end how everybody did. You got to keep score at home on the honor system. Okay, so we've got a guess of C, guess of A, guess of C. So the correct answer here is C. And the reason that I want to underscore this is that, okay, so this means that just in that few years period, 2/3 of all the payouts from the crop insurance program, right, which is heavily subsidized by taxpayers, right? So that's the point I'm trying to get out here, that these are events that cost us a lot of money too, and they do a lot of damages to farms, they do a lot of damages to communities, right? So just in that several year period, of course, what is the cause of a crop insurance payout is going to vary from year to year. If you've seen photos of the damage from the windstorm earlier this week, I'm sure that that is going to be the major one for 2020, if I had to guess. But so that cause is going to vary from year to year, but over this year period, it was 2/3 of the payouts, right? So these are very costly events, and just kind of underscoring this more, we're continuing to experience these billion-dollar flooding disasters. And so this is, again, from that NOAA database that I mentioned. So they track these billion-dollar disasters. And so what you see here are the most recent years graphed. You can see the average in black as to how many billion-dollar flood disasters there were. So this is just me sorting by floods. And for 2020, we are trending above average. You know, and we're not just experiencing these flood events, we're experiencing these unusual flooding events, right? And so I've showed this photo several times when I've given talks recently. So this is a photo from my partner's family's Century Farm on the Middle Loop River in St. Paul. So they're right on the river, and they've lost, I don't know, at least a dozen or so farmable acres to the moving of the river. And they're probably pretty lucky, right? Considering that there were areas that had so much sand deposition or erosion that land just, it's not even economically feasible to have to move all that sand to make it farmable again. So of course, this wasn't an unusual event that, you know, all of you drive around Nebraska just as I do, I imagine, and we still find roads and bridges that are out, right? So as we have these flood events, of course, the flooding event was highly unusual. This is the only one I could find in that billion-dollar database that was a winter flood event. So we know we had a ton of water just in our environment last year from the heavy rainfall the year before, from all that snow that was just sitting on the surface. We had frozen soil. So like hydrologically speaking, it was just sort of a really terrible, perfect storm of things that happened. But just to make the point that we're experiencing these events, they're damaging, they're traumatic, and they're very costly, right? And they take a long time to replace, especially when we think, or to rebuild from, especially as we think about what could be happening in rural communities. Okay, so we know that these flood events are kind of only part of the story. When we think about impacts to agriculture, we know that producers and communities also have to deal with growing rainfall variability. So it's not just, you know, a super heavy flood event, it's also like the one day when you get 2 inches of rain in 30 minutes, right? So the most recent national climate assessments, I'm just showing data here from 2014, but the report in 2018 shows that these heaviest 1% of rainfall days continue to increase across the United States. And so I'm building to the point here of how does our agriculture and our soil intersect with this, and how can the soil actually be part of a solution to it? But I just want to also share, you know, that in the context of this growing rainfall variability that we're experiencing, another important element of the problem that's been happening, or what's contributing to the problems that we see, is that we have agricultural landscapes that have changed. And I have this old land cover of Iowa, which again, much of Iowa looks a lot like parts of Nebraska too, that in the mid-1800s, the land use was perennially based, that it was mostly forests or prairies. So you had plants that were using water all year long. And now we have land cover amongst much of our state, as you have in Iowa, of yellow here is corn, green is soybean. So I'm sure you all realize those are summer annual crops. They're growing and using water right now, but that's only a small portion of the year, right? So it's only a small portion of the year when the soil is covered with living roots, as well as with water being utilized by the plants throughout the year. So we have more flooding, more heavy rain events over the last number of decades. It coincides with this change in our cropping systems when you don't have significant plant cover, roots in the soil growing and transpiring. And so when I think about, again, how soil can be a part of the solution of this, and how I hope that we are going to be on a better path with the discussions around soil health and activity in Nebraska, is that I like to describe the soil surface as where the action is, right? So when we think about all of these aspects of water that have a very costly and sometimes damaging impact on our lives, like they're all converging right here at the soil surface, right? So where rain is infiltrating into the soil, where plants are needing to take up water to grow, where you have evaporative losses from the soil, where you have runoff that's taking soil potentially with it, leading to more water pollution, right? So that's all converging at the soil surface. So the way that we manage our soil, when we think about those principles of soil health that I already mentioned, that can lead us to improved water outcomes. And so I just have a few more slides to show you, and then I'm happy to take questions. I just want to make the point that, you know, there's some good research that I've been a part of, that I'm continuing to be a part of here when we think about water management and like, what does this actually mean? So we know that healthier soils can have more organic matter, can hold more water. The work that was a part of that Omaha World Herald story, this is kind of the main punchline from it. This was the big infographic that we put together from it. The idea is that we compared more conventional practices to some of these practices that are more in line with principles of soil health. And we looked at how much these different practices could improve infiltration rates. And what we found that for all these practices, the two that offered the most continuous and largest improvements in infiltration, again, a really important process when we think about water and our landscapes, water getting into the soil, was cover crops and perennial crops compared to no cover crops or annual crops, right? So having those continuous roots in the soil, we saw when we looked across many studies around the world, had the largest opportunity for increasing water. And this is like so consistent with many of the stories that I hear from farmers. Nobody loves a good water infiltration anecdote more than I do. This is a really good one. So I'm a part of, along with a graduate student who's working with me, Fernanda Krupek, and we have a great partnership with UNL Extension and the NRCS, where we are working with doing on-farm research with farmers who've incorporated various aspects of soil health practices onto their farms. And so one of the farmers talked about in this news release here, his experience with his rye cover crop after the flood. And so I'm known to sometimes talk about a healthier soils acting like a sponge and holding on to more water. But here, Noah's describing his farm after the flooding as an arc, which I think is really interesting, right? So we know that at that time, a lot of the soil surface was frozen, but as that water receded, he felt that his observation was that because his cover crop was there protecting his soil, that he had just a great benefit. And they describe it as the arc, which again, I think is another nice metaphor for thinking about the benefit of a healthier soil when we think about water, when we think about the damage that some of these events can cause. Okay, so we heart soil. I'm wearing my Nebraska red today. Last photo as I lead into my summary, if anyone's seen the hearts around town in Lincoln. Some of the glamour shots we got of our dog there, my last transition. So finally, before I open up for questions, just want to close with these thoughts, right? So we talked about what is soil. I know it's alive. It takes a long time to form, but we can erode it or degrade it, you know, within a day or a year. That within our state, we're home to a disproportionate percentage of very productive and fertile soils. And even though we might lead the Corn Belt and no-till acres, there's other aspects like cover crops that we could continue to improve on in terms of use across our croplands. And as we think about, you know, the risks that flooding and heavy rain events can cause, if we're thinking about a healthier soil, we can manage some of those risks through some of those principles of soil health. And I thank you for your attention and for playing along. You'll have to tell me what your scores were, but I kind of suspect that there were some people who got 7 out of 7 right. So my email address is here and I look forward to questions. So feel free to follow up or stay in touch. Thank you.
Okay, we have some questions here. The first question came in rather early, and it's from Maya Moore. Says, what is a good way to test soil health for gardening in soil in Lincoln, Nebraska?
So, I mean, I think that, you know, testing your soil is kind of one of the first things that we talk about with students, and just the foundation for good agronomy recommendations. So I think testing soil in a gardening sense. So I'm not sure what is a good way. I would suggest trying to get some kind of distribution of soil. So don't take just one soil sample. I don't know how large your garden might be, but trying to get some kind of distribution across your garden. If you have a spade or if you have a probe, maybe getting a little bit just below the first few inches to test. But there are commercial labs that you can send those tests to. There are also things that you can buy online. I don't know if that's a specific enough answer for you, but I feel like looking for organic matter, for pH, for some of the plant macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, those are good things to at least get started on evaluating if you have nutrient deficiencies, depending on pH, because if your pH of your soil is too acidic or too basic, then that's going to make some of those nutrients unavailable. So I think getting kind of a distribution of soil from different parts of your field, labeling them and making sure you remember where you got them. So you can see, especially if you have a larger area that you're gardening from. I mean, that's like kind of the nuts and bolts of what we would do even on a farm. So if that is not specific enough, then feel free to add more to the chat.
All right, and we got another one here that says, how can we learn from and work with indigenous groups when advocating for soil health?
I think that is a great question. I think that there's probably a lot that we can learn from people who have been on the land for a longer period of time. I think that I think we could certainly do a better job, at least from a university standpoint, but for all of us, I think that the first thing would be listening and learning about what some of the tribes in Nebraska have done in the past, and what they're interested in. So I think listening is always a good place to start, which is kind of a generic answer, but I'd be happy if you want to share more thoughts in the chat too. I see Nathan's question also about what can I do as an average person? And that's such a great question, Nathan. I would say being informed and even aware of the fact that there are programs out there that some of what the debates have talked about and what has been floated by various presidential candidates, there's a number of legislative ideas out there that would increase the use of some of these conservation programs or increase the funding that would go to some of these programs. And those are things that you can make phone calls and advocate for, right? I think, as we have less people who are farming and less people who have ties to farming, the constituency that is interested in these issues can decline. But I do think that, especially when we think about soil health and communities and flooding and it behooves all of us to have, and water pollution too. I mean, that's not even something I've really I've mentioned it a few times, but I think just being engaged more in what the issues are. If you are, I don't know where you are based, Nathan, but you could probably go to a natural resources district board meeting in your area, or at least be tuned into their meeting minutes and see what those issues are in your area, because we have a great governance system here with our natural resources district that are based on watershed boundaries. And just, I think being aware is probably the short answer that I would give to you, but just knowing that this is an issue that we need people to advocate for the soil. Following along with news, you'll probably hear now that you're a little more tuned in, when the Healthy Soils Task Force puts out their recommendations, I imagine there'll be some media attention around that. So being aware, telling your friends about it, and starting potentially to be more engaged in what might be happening in your community with the natural resource district, or again, even at the state level.
Maya had a follow-up question in the chat box. She said a garden that she would like to test is 50 by 100 feet in area, and she wanted to know what pH is good for crop, like what is a pH level that is good, and what would be the cheapest way to effectively test an area that way.
So that's a large area for garden. I mean, I guess it kind of depends on the precision that you might want to test. That for that area, you might divide it into like 6 or 8 segments, number it, and take some samples. Because if that was an area in a large farm, we'd probably even just take 1 sample from it. But for your garden, I mean, you might also want to test based on, you know, what different crops you've grown in different areas. You know, and then just in terms of pH, you know, that is going to depend a little bit like crop to crop. But somewhere in the 5.5, 6 range is probably a good guess. But again, if you were to Google for horticultural crops pH, you should be able to find that information too. You know, and in terms of cost effectiveness, like if you're talking about 6 to 8 samples to do like basic analysis is not going to be more than probably, I don't know, maybe $10 a sample. So you're not talking about a huge cost, and you could take soil samples every year, or you could do that less frequently. So it might be an investment that you make every couple of years. And I do see actually that Richard had a comment about crop insurance costs and underwriting crops grown in risky floodplains. And I think that's a very valid question. I think it's kind of more of a comment. But I would say, you know, to the point of Nathan's question too, of what can people do, I think just being aware of the fact that taxpayers underwrite crop insurance and that there could be practices that are riskier than others. And so I think that crop insurance, and if you talk to farmers, that they will often agree that it can be a perverse incentive for farming acreage that is not as, it can incentivize riskier behavior, let's say it that way. So I don't know that we should, right? Because, you know, if for the some of the work that I've done in the past related to soil and water, I've looked more into kind of some of the, like floodplain management. I don't know a huge amount about it, but sort of like floodplain policy. And, you know, you can get, if a municipality is doing more things to reduce their flood risk, then they can, you know, get all kinds of benefits from the government too. So it seems like a logical concept, and it's definitely something that has gotten traction, at least from my understanding and sort of the policy world around some of these things. But again, if there was more interest from the public to say, hey, you know, we would like to see our dollars go to things that are less risky, I think that that's totally valid. And I would agree that this is definitely an issue in terms of urban and urbanizing areas, that like all the concepts that we're talking about. And I see Maya's question about, or not, maybe it's not Maya, Kathy's question about cover crops in gardens. You know, all the concepts that we're talking about soil health could certainly apply to green infrastructure in urban areas, could apply to gardens, but of course the context and how they're applied is going to be different. And just in terms of cover crop use for small vegetable garden, and I'm getting all kinds of specific types of questions here. It would depend on, excuse me, what, I mean, the biggest thing with cover crops that I always recommend to people is, what is your goal, right? Is if it's to prevent erosion, if it's just to get soil cover, if it's to put some nitrogen back in the soil, then that's all going to have an impact on what you might recommend. You know, for a vegetable garden, I'm imagining that, you know, even by later this month, you might have some areas that are bare because you've harvested all the crops that were there. And that would be an opportunity to grow something that it is more suited to like late summer. I like buckwheat a lot for gardens. just to attract pollinators and to get some biomass. That's not something that's going to survive the winter. So if you want something that's going to survive the winter, you might grow something like cereal rye. It's a really common cover crop grown here. So it really depends on your goals if you wanted to overwinter. But I think all the cover crops that you might, many of the cover crops, I should say, that you might think about growing, and field crops you could do in a vegetable garden as well. But I think in a vegetable garden, you probably need to consider a little more to how you're going to terminate it. If you're going to do some kind of tilling, if you're going to plant right into it, definitely the termination, I think, becomes a little more critical in that setting. Hopefully that gives you a few pointers to get started. I see another question about the indigenous populations and university working with them in terms of soil health. As far as I know, there's not something in the works already. It's definitely something I've thought about, and I don't know who anonymous attendee is, but I would be happy to follow up with you if it's maybe something that you're already working on. I do have some connections and contacts, but it's I've just been here for a little under 3 years, so I've certainly not gotten to explore all the partnerships that I would like to. So I would be happy to talk more with you about it. So my email address is on that screen, so feel free to follow up with me. I see we're right at 7:30, but Nathan, how is soil formed? There's 5 soil forming factors: the parent material of the soil, time, vegetation, climate, and topography. So it's essentially the weathering processes that break down that parent material. That's a short answer. But if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to share my slides. And I know that this presentation is recorded. So it was right at the beginning, we talked about soil formation. I'm hoping that I addressed many of the questions. I see we're at 7:30. I don't know if we were supposed to end, Eric, on the hour, but I'm happy to continue fielding questions.
I mean, it's entirely up to you. If we don't have any more questions, we can definitely go ahead and end this if there's no other questions. People have already dropped out, so. Well, I thank everyone for attending. Thank you for having great questions as well. And we will put this on our YouTube page, and we will also be sharing it on our Facebook pages if you would like to share it and watch the whole presentation again.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for joining.